Hello and welcome back to Z Sci-Fi Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, leaving us without the operating budget to pay our dedicated staff. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our team can cover their living expenses and continue creating these adventures for you, which you can easily do by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or clicking the link in the description or pinned comment. The air in the tactical simulation room reeked of ozone, sulfur, and the heavy musk of predatory pheromones. Amidst a sea of clicking mandibles, venomous barbs, and shifting armor plates, a single creature sat wrapped in nothing but fragile, exposed skin and a crisp fabric uniform. Cadet Edward Buchanan did not belong here, yet his biometric monitor pulsed at a terrifyingly calm 60 beats per minute. The Galactic Academy was not built with humanity in mind. Its halls were scaled for behemoths, and its seats were designed to accommodate heavy tails, expansive wings, and defensive biological spikes. Edward sat perfectly still at his metal desk, a lone figure of soft flesh and bone, isolated in a vast amphitheater of lethal biodiversity. The auditory assault of the room was relentless. There was the abrasive, metallic scrape of heavy chitin rubbing against alloyed chairs, the low-frequency, bone-rattling rumble of reptilian throats clearing, and the wet, acidic tang that hung thick in the artificial atmosphere. A chorus of mocking hisses and guttural sneers echoed across the tiered rows of the lecture hall. A towering bruxus, boasting 4 heavily muscled arms that ended in razor-sharp bone scythes, chattered its mandibles in a staccato rhythm. The universal translation matrix embedded in the room's architecture rendered the sound into pure, unadulterated disdain. To the varied apex species of the cosmos, Earth was a cosmic anomaly, a pathetic joke of a planet. Humans possessed no hardened biological carapace to deflect energy blasts. They harbored no neurotoxic venom glands to incapacitate their foes, nor did they boast retractable claws or cloaking chromatophores. They were soft, blind, and infinitely pliable. The alien cadets whispered among themselves, placing wagers on exactly how many solar cycles the fragile primate would survive before being inadvertently torn apart in the crowded hallways. Then, the ambient temperature in the room plummeted. The primary lighting arrays flickered, dimming momentarily as a massive, localized electromagnetic interference washed over the chamber. The heavy entry doors parted, and Vargok stepped inside. He was a sovereign of the apex hunters, a juvenile of a species feared across the entire quadrant. Dark, obsidian scales cascaded down his hulking frame, each one thicker than standard starship hull plating. With every heavy, deliberate step he took, violent arcs of bioelectric energy snapped and hissed across his hide, scorching the metallic floorboards beneath his heavy feet. The ambient chatter of the room died an immediate death. The suffocating silence that followed was broken only by the angry crackle of Vargok's volatile energy. The alien cadets instinctively recoiled, pressing their bodies hard against the far bulkheads, desperately clearing a wide, uncontested path for the newcomer. Vargok did not head toward the heavily reinforced isolation pens at the back of the hall, the shielded areas specifically constructed to contain his volatile species. Instead, his glowing, multifaceted eyes locked directly onto the lone human. Each step he took sent a rhythmic, heavy thud vibrating up through the floorboards, a sound that promised absolute violence. He marched straight down the central aisle and stopped directly beside Edward. The towering beast leaned down, his massive, scaled head hovering mere inches from the cadet. Vargok parted his heavy jaws, revealing row upon row of serrated fangs. Thick, viscous saliva dripped from his maw, a highly magnetized fluid that physically warped the air as it fell and hissed against the metal deck. Then, with a loud, metallic groan from the reinforced chair, Vargok threw his massive bulk down into the seat immediately adjacent to the human. The surrounding cadets stopped breathing. Hundreds of multifaceted eyes and thermal sensors locked onto the pair. They braced for the inevitable spray of crimson, fully expecting the apex predator to tear the frail earthling to pieces, simply to establish dominance over the immediate territory. Edward Buchanan did not flinch. He did not pull away from the terrifying heat radiating from the beast, nor did he shrink down into his seat. With slow, deliberate precision, the human lifted a hand and casually smoothed a minor crease from the thigh of his standard-issue uniform. On the console directly in front of him, his public biometric readout remained entirely undisturbed. The green line charting his pulse flowed across the digital screen in a lazy, rhythmic wave, holding perfectly steady at exactly 60 beats per minute. At the front of the lecture hall stood Instructor Kalen. His towering body was an elegant, jagged structure constructed entirely of cold, translucent silicon crystals that caught and refracted the dim lighting of the room. A faint, malicious inner light pulsed within the crystalline structure of his face, contorting his sharp, inorganic features into a cruel, mocking smile. Slowly, deliberately, Kalen raised a single crystalline finger and tapped a rhythmic sequence onto his master control terminal. A deafening, synchronized crash echoed through the chamber. Heavy, thick titanium blast doors slammed down over every exit, violently shaking the walls. The pneumatic seals hissed as they engaged, completely locking the physical space and simultaneously severing all external communication lines. The lesson had begun. The crisp, white illumination of the lecture hall died in a fraction of a second. In its absolute absence, a harsh, blaring emergency red saturated every microscopic inch of the sealed titanium box. The sudden shift in the visual spectrum aggressively warped the already monstrous silhouettes of the alien cadets, casting long, jagged shadows against the heavily barricaded walls. The air instantly felt heavier, as if the physical space was rapidly shrinking, compressing the varied biological forms together into an inescapable pressure cooker. High above the chaotic floor, the internal public address system crackled to life. Instructor Kalen's voice, stripped entirely of its usual sharp, academic cadence, filtered down through thick layers of static. The synthesized tone dripped with a cold, terrifying amusement. Cadets, welcome to your impromptu assessment. Subject 0 gravity, psychological survival. The speakers clicked off with a sharp pop. Immediately following the terrifying silence, a low, mechanical grinding echoed deep within the ceiling infrastructure. The heavy, industrial grates of the central ventilation system snapped aggressively open. However, instead of the recycled chill of artificial oxygen that the inhabitants desperately craved, the vents began to violently disgorge a dense, sickly yellow vapor. The specialized neuroconflict stimulant cascaded down in thick, heavy sheets. It sank rapidly toward the floor, instantly dissolving into the breathable atmosphere and clinging to the exposed skin and scales of everyone trapped inside. The chemical cocktail hit the diverse alien biology in mere seconds. The insidious gas was meticulously engineered to aggressively bypass higher cognitive reasoning and directly ignite the most primal, violent centers of the brain. The air grew impossibly thick, suffocatingly tight, as blind panic and territorial rage flared in equal measure. Sanity simply evaporated into the yellow fog. The previously tense symphony of the room shifted abruptly into a chaotic, deafening cacophony of raw, unhinged aggression. Claws forged of bone and reinforced chitin frantically tore into the solid alloy of the desks, shredding the thick metal like wet parchment. Guttural shrieks and agonized roars bounced violently off the impenetrable titanium blast doors. Pores and specialized endocrine glands across dozens of different predatory species simultaneously erupted, aggressively flooding the already tight space with noxious, territorial threat pheromones. This invisible chemical warfare layered heavily over the choking neurogas, creating an atmosphere so incredibly dense it felt exactly like breathing liquid lead. The walls seemed to aggressively push inward, crushing the combatants together into a boiling cauldron of pure, unadulterated instinct. Oxygen was becoming a fleeting memory. At the desk, shoved against the far bulkhead, the giant predator felt the immediate, rushing impact of the stimulant. Vargok's massive, heavily armored frame shuddered violently. He whipped his heavy, scaled head toward Edward with blinding speed. The beast let out a deafening, chest-rattling growl that vibrated painfully through the metal floor plates and deep into human bone. The volatile bioelectric sparks dancing across his obsidian hide flared uncontrollably into blinding, jagged streaks of localized lightning. The searing arcs whipped dangerously close to the human's face, physically singing the very edges of his academy uniform. Vargok shifted his immense bulk, throwing his heavy shoulders forward and physically boxing Edward into the sharp, metallic corner of the wall. The beast leaned heavily over the desk, his searing, magnetic breath washing over the human in suffocating waves. He was actively demanding submission, demanding panic, desperately trying to squeeze a single ounce of primal terror out of this fragile, fleshy anomaly trapped in his shadow. Edward Buchanan ignored the towering nightmare completely, as the vital oxygen in the room seemed to rapidly burn away under the collective hyperventilation of 100 raging beasts. The human simply let his eyelids drop halfway. He firmly locked the doors of his own mind, retreating deep into the absolute, freezing stillness of his classified special operations conditioning, while the towering aliens around him surrendered willingly to the chemical fire burning in their veins. Edward weaponized his remaining senses. He mapped the chaotic, swirling currents of the yellow gas by feeling the microscopic shifts in the air pressure against his exposed cheek. He meticulously isolated the heavy, erratic rhythm of Vargok's massive lungs, pulling in the toxic atmosphere. But more importantly, beneath the roaring, blinding madness of the suffocating room, he felt something else entirely. Deep beneath the solid titanium deck plates, an aggressive, unnatural shift in the local magnetic field was beginning to pulse. It was a rhythmic, rising wave of wildly unstable energy that had absolutely nothing to do with the stimulant gas currently pumping from the ceiling vents. Across the aisle, the heavy friction of the room finally reached its absolute breaking point. A hulking, bipedal reptilian cadet, its neural pathways utterly fried and overridden by the chemical cocktail, locked its heavily bloodshot, slit-pupilled eyes directly onto the human, driven entirely by the maddening, instinctual need to assert dominance by violently slaughtering the weakest physical entity in the territory. The massive reptile let out a blood-curdling roar. Its massive, heavily clawed feet launched it violently over a shattered metal desk, propelling its sheer, heavily armored tonnage through the yellow fog directly toward the corner occupied by Vargok and the human. Absolute, unadulterated pandemonium exploded within the tightly sealed chamber as bodies clashed. Blood sprayed, and the weaker cadets scrambled frantically to escape the impending, localized carnage. Yet, trapped hard against the bulkhead with an apex predator looming massively over him and a raging reptilian juggernaut hurtling straight at his face, Edward remained completely, terrifyingly motionless. He did not scream. He did not brace for the fatal impact. Down by his side, heavily obscured in the narrow, dark shadow of the desk, his right index finger methodically began to strike against the cold steel beneath him. A silent, steady rhythm of Morse code, perfectly calculating the exact trajectory of chaos and the surging magnetic death beneath them in a room rapidly, inevitably, running out of time. The hulking reptilian cadet was airborne, a massive projectile of muscle and scale driven entirely by chemically induced madness. Its heavy jaws unhinged, revealing jagged rows of serrated bone aimed directly at the human's unprotected throat. The impact was an absolute certainty, a violent conclusion to a fragile, soft-skinned existence. Yet, the anticipated sound of tearing flesh and shattering bone never materialized. Instead, an explosion of blinding, localized energy violently displaced the very air in the room. Vargok, the towering apex predator, who had spent the last several minutes aggressively crowding Edward into the bulkhead, did not strike the human. In a sudden, jarring movement that completely defied the brutal, selfish logic of the animal kingdom, the massive beast planted his heavy feet, braced his heavily armored shoulders, and violently pivoted his back toward the fragile cadet. Vargok became a living, breathing shield. The volatile arcs of bioelectric current that had been dangerously sparking across his obsidian scales suddenly coalesced, with a deafening, thunderous crack that shattered the remaining ambient noise in the hall. Vargok unleashed a focused, massive electromagnetic pulse directly into the broad chest of the leaping reptile. The sheer, concussive force of the blast lifted the airborne juggernaut entirely off its trajectory, hurling its massive tonnage backward through the dense, yellow fog. The reptile slammed violently into the far barricade, with a sickening crunch of fracturing bone and dented titanium, collapsing immediately into a motionless, smoking heap. The chaotic brawling across the lecture hall ground to a sudden, stunned halt. The bewildered alien cadets stared through the toxic haze, their drug-addled minds struggling desperately to comprehend the impossible, suicidal altruism of an apex killer. Before the profound shock could fully settle into their chemically altered brains, the massive, panoramic observation screen spanning the front wall flickered violently to life. The harsh, clinical glow cut sharply through the dim, red-tinted room. Instructor Kalen's translucent, crystalline face loomed above them, magnified to a monstrous, omnipotent scale. The cruel, mocking smile had vanished completely, replaced by an expression of cold, absolute detachment. "Attention, cadets!" Kalen's synthesized voice echoed from the overhead arrays, crisp, clear, and utterly unbothered by the suffocating atmosphere below. "I must offer a slight correction to my previous statement regarding our curriculum. There is no psychological survival assessment occurring today. In fact, this physical space no longer exists on the Academy's primary network." A collective, panicked murmur of confusion and terror rippled through the remaining conscious students as they stared up at their executioner. "You are currently standing directly above the facility's secondary antimatter containment core," Kalen continued, his tone chillingly conversational, as if lecturing on minor historical trivialities. "A core that is currently experiencing a catastrophic, irreversible overload due to a deeply regrettable technical malfunction. The blast doors will not open. The ventilation system is sealed. Within roughly 4 minutes, the structural integrity of the magnetic containment field will fail completely, resulting in a localized vaporizing event." Kalen's crystalline eyes shifted, locking directly onto the panting, exhausted form of Vargok. "It is a profound tragedy," the instructor stated, his voice dripping with venomous political calculation and deep-seated prejudice. "An entire class of promising young minds lost to a random mechanical failure. But history often requires a blood sacrifice to ensure stability. The royal bloodline of the Apex Worlds ends today, buried under the ashes of a tragic accident. Your dynasty is a threat to the new galactic order, Vargok, and so you will burn, surrounded by the collateral damage required to make your assassination entirely beyond suspicion." The massive screen abruptly snapped to black, plunging the room back into the suffocating, red-lit gloom. The communication feed was entirely dead. A terrifying, deep bass rumble vibrated violently up through the titanium deck plates. The metal floor visibly warped and buckled. Microfractures began to spiderweb across the heavy alloy, emitting faint, deadly blue streams of raw, unfiltered radiation. The atmospheric pressure inside the room spiked dramatically as the antimatter core beneath them began its final, terminal expansion. Vargok let out a low, agonizing groan. The massive beast dropped heavily to one knee. Thick, glowing blue blood began to seep from the micro-fissures in his thick armor. The tremendous effort of discharging the defensive electromagnetic pulse to save the human had dangerously depleted his internal energy reserves, leaving his biological shields critically vulnerable to the surging magnetic storm ripping through the floorboards. The truth of the situation finally slammed into the collective understanding of the room. A psychological revelation far more shocking than the impending thermal explosion. The audience of alien cadets, and perhaps the universe itself, had profoundly misunderstood the dynamic in the corner of the room. Vargok had never approached the human to intimidate him. The royal predator possessed highly specialized biological sensory organs, capable of detecting microscopic shifts in planetary magnetic fields. He had felt the terrible, unstable hum of the overloading antimatter core the very moment he stepped into the academic sector. In a room filled with terrified, chemically altered aliens, every single creature was projecting a loud, chaotic, terrifying electromagnetic signature. They were blinding beacons of biological panic, adding heavily to the overwhelming sensory static that was agonizing the juvenile predator's mind. But the human was entirely different. Edward's magnetic signature was completely, unnervingly absent, in the dead center of a raging, invisible hurricane of lethal energy. The human cadet from Earth was a dead zone, a void, a perfectly silent, static anchor. Vargok had not trapped Edward in the corner to torture him. The beast had desperately thrown himself into the only safe harbor available in a sea of madness. He had huddled against the frail earthling, seeking the profound, protective silence of a creature that emitted absolutely zero biological panic. All around them, the mighty beasts of the cosmos began to fall. The sheer, crushing physical pressure of the escalating energy surge, combined with the leaking, toxic radiation, forced the massive cadets to the floor. Reinforced chitin cracked under the invisible weight. Heavy scales shed and blistered. The apex predators of a dozen different savage worlds lay gasping, entirely helpless against the invisible, overwhelming might of physics turning aggressively against them. They were evolutionary marvels built to fight with fangs, claws, and brute strength. But they had absolutely no defense against the elemental fury of an overloading star core. In the corner of the fracturing room, the rhythmic, metallic tapping on the desk finally ceased. Edward Buchanan stopped counting the microscopic thermal shifts in the floorboards. He let his right hand drop smoothly to his side. Slowly, deliberately, the human opened his eyes. The placid, harmless gaze of the weak, soft-skinned cadet was completely gone. The veil of terrifying stillness dropped, revealing the terrifying truth beneath the fragile flesh. His eyes were cold, calculating, and painfully sharp. It was a look forged in the unforgiving fires of a death world, a savage planet where survival required a ruthless, unrelenting defiance of extinction, while the alien cadets were paralyzing under the crushing weight of inevitable death. Edward simply analyzed the physical variables of his cage. The prey had finally stopped pretending. The true predator in the room had just awakened. Edward stood up. The illusion of the fragile, soft-skinned cadet evaporated completely into the superheated air of the sealed chamber. With a swift, aggressively violent motion, he grabbed the thick, reinforced collar of his standard-issue Academy uniform and ripped it forcefully downward. The advanced synthetic fabric tore completely down the middle with a sharp, echoing shred, pooling uselessly at his heavy boots and exposing his bare torso to the rapidly escalating ambient heat. Where the surrounding extraterrestrial elites had fully expected to see only vulnerable, easily punctured, weak flesh, they were instead confronted with the terrifying, absolute pinnacle of highly classified human engineering. A complex, brutal, interlocking lattice of dark, synthetic carbon weave and heavy metallic cybernetic nodes was surgically grafted directly into his spinal column. The thick, aggressive metallic ridges ran continuously from the absolute base of his skull all the way down into his lower lumbar vertebrae, pulsating violently with a faint, cold blue light. This was the Aegis Protocol. It was a fiercely guarded, artificial evolutionary standard mandated exclusively for Earth's absolute most elite special operations units. Humanity had spent countless centuries looking out at a hostile, overwhelmingly biologically superior universe, filled entirely with nightmare creatures, born naturally with impenetrable armor, rapid cellular regeneration, and neurotoxic venom. Earth's response to this cosmic disparity was not to hide or surrender. If humanity could not naturally evolve a hardened biological carapace over millions of years, they would simply forge an infinitely superior, virtually indestructible nervous system in the unforgiving, rapid fires of advanced biomechanical engineering. The physical environment inside the tightly sealed lecture hall rapidly and aggressively degraded into an apocalyptic, physics-defying nightmare. The ambient temperature violently spiked well past 180 degrees Fahrenheit and continued its exponential, deadly climb, aggressively boiling the remaining moisture entirely out of the breathable atmosphere. Beneath the buckled, groaning titanium floorboards, the localized magnetic containment field actively holding the volatile, swirling antimatter core finally reached a critical point of structural failure. The resulting, violent subatomic friction birthed a terrifying, localized microgravity anomaly that erupted without warning within the chamber. Massive, heavily reinforced titanium desks violently sheared completely off their thick steel base bolts with deafening metallic shrieks. The heavy furniture began to float lazily upward, slowly rotating in the superheated, heavily ionized air before being brutally torn apart into jagged, spinning shrapnel by conflicting, invisible gravitational shearing forces. Splinters of razor-sharp alloy and completely shattered data terminal screens hung suspended in the bleeding red emergency light, transforming the entire volume of the room into a chaotic, zero-gravity meat grinder operating at maximum velocity. While the surviving Apex alien cadets writhed helplessly on the floating, disjointed floor plates, violently vomiting bioluminescent fluids and desperately clawing at their own rapidly blistering scales in an agonizing, chemically induced panic. Edward moved with terrifying, cold, calculated precision, his heavy magnetic boots locked firmly to the violently vibrating deck. He reached down to his left wrist and viciously twisted the heavy, dense black metallic limiter surgically locked securely around his forearm. The biometric security seal hissed loudly, instantly recognizing his unique human genetic signature for an absolute emergency override, and snapped open violently. From deep beneath the synthetic dermal layer of his forearm, a dozen thick, heavily insulated magnetic tether cables unspooled rapidly, moving exactly like a nest of striking metallic vipers. Edward dropped heavily to his knees, right beside the groaning, massive apex predator. Vargok's once overwhelmingly proud, shimmering obsidian armor was rapidly fading into a dull, sickly, and dying gray ash as his internal bioelectric energy reserves completely and utterly flatlined. The massive, royal beast was actively suffocating under the crushing, invisible weight of the ambient magnetic storm. Edward did not hesitate for a single, solitary fraction of a second. He gripped the heavy, writhing tethers and violently drove the jagged, highly conductive metallic tips directly and deeply into the dying, exposed bioelectric neural clusters heavily concentrated at the thick base of Vargok's massive neck. The giant alien beast convulsed violently, letting out a choked, agonizing, guttural gasp as the cold metal violently pierced his failing biology. Edward locked his grip even tighter, brutally anchoring his own physical form to the dying extraterrestrial. "Hold the line," the human ordered, his voice a harsh, heavy, metallic rasp, cutting sharply through the deafening roar of tearing physics. With a sharp, heavily practiced mental command, Edward fully activated his dormant spinal nodes. He weaponized his own humanity. He forcefully transformed his heavily modified central nervous system into a living, breathing, high-capacity lightning rod and a highly efficient biomechanical power transformer, bypassing absolutely every single natural safety limit built into the fragile human body. Edward forcefully reversed the polarity of his entire internal cybernetic grid. He actively began to suck the chaotic, wildly unstable, and completely lethal antimatter radiation directly out of the ambient atmosphere and pulling the apocalyptic energy straight out of the alien's failing body, channeling the localized death straight into his own heavily modified veins. The sheer, unadulterated physical agony of aggressively absorbing the raw, unfiltered fury of a collapsing star core hit Edward with the crushing, overwhelming kinetic force of a direct orbital strike. The human biological chassis was absolutely, fundamentally never meant to channel or store this terrifying volume of pure, destructive energy. The extreme, localized internal pressure aggressively tore at his fragile cellular structure. Countless microscopic capillaries across his broad chest, muscular arms, and angular face violently ruptured simultaneously. He began weeping thick streams of dark crimson blood that instantly vaporized into a fine pink mist the exact moment they hit the superheated, ionized air. His human muscles locked violently tight in a state of absolute, agonizing, unyielding tetanus, his jaw clenching hard enough to audibly crack his own heavily reinforced molars. Yet, the human nervous system absolutely refused to yield or collapse. It was a biological framework heavily forged on a savage, unforgiving death world, deeply renowned throughout the entire galaxy for its endless, violent tectonic upheavals, its category 5 atmospheric storms, and its constant, aggressive, extinction-level planetary events. Humans had absolutely not climbed to the absolute top of their food chain by being the strongest or the sharpest. They survived by enduring the absolute unendurable. The thick, cybernetic lattice violently running down Edward's arched spine glowed a blinding, searing hot, brilliant white, frantically compressing, routing, and safely storing the lethal atmospheric radiation, effectively and completely shielding the entire room by willingly turning his own fragile, bleeding body into a sacrificial, indestructible energy sponge. Vargok, painfully gasping for fresh breath, as the crushing, lethal weight of the ambient radiation was miraculously and forcefully lifted completely from his failing internal organs, looked up through the swirling, blood-stained, zero-gravity chaos. His highly advanced, multifaceted ocular sensors dilated wide in absolute, unadulterated shock and profound awe. Towering immediately above him stood the lone Earthling. The creature was heavily bleeding, his fragile skin violently blistering and burning under the extreme heat, bathed entirely in a terrifying, crackling, violent halo of highly destructive blue antimatter energy. This weak creature possessed absolutely no hardened chitinous carapace to deflect the extreme heat. It boasted no razor-sharp fangs or venomous stingers to aggressively assert its dominance. It was infinitely fragile, entirely soft, and currently bleeding profusely from every single pore on its trembling body. But as the juvenile apex predator watched the heavily bleeding human casually and forcefully shoulder the apocalyptic, world-ending fury of a localized antimatter breach without yielding a single, solitary inch of ground, a profound, terrifying epiphany washed entirely over the exhausted beast. As he stared up at the bleeding special operative, Vargok finally understood the terrifying, true nature of the galaxy's absolute newest species. True, unadulterated terror in the infinite cosmos absolutely did not come from the ultimate sharpness of a bone claw or the crushing kinetic power of a heavy reptilian jaw. Ultimate, inescapable, absolute terror was witnessing the infinite, terrifying endurance of a seemingly weak, fragile species that simply, stubbornly, and violently refused to die. The internal telemetry screaming across Edward's optic nerve was flashing a catastrophic, blinding warning. The advanced cybernetic lattice violently fused to his spine had officially reached 100% saturation. He was physically holding the raw, unbridled fury of a localized sun inside a frail, organic shell that was rapidly breaking down at the cellular level. If he maintained the aggressive containment for even 10 seconds longer, the sheer volume of compressed antimatter radiation would forcibly ignite the carbon in his own bones. He would not just die, he would completely detonate, instantly transforming himself into a biological thermal nuclear warhead that would completely vaporize the lecture hall and every single living creature trapped within it. He desperately needed a physical grounding point, a massive, highly conductive target to violently discharge the lethal, overloaded battery he had just become. Through the swirling, superheated vortex of floating, zero-gravity metallic debris and agonizing, crimson emergency light, Edward forcefully locked his heavily bleeding eyes onto the massive barricade that sealed their tomb. The gigantic, 1-meter-thick titanium blast doors were heavily reinforced by an industrial-grade magnetic locking mechanism, completely engineered to be impervious to standard artillery fire. It was the absolute perfect, highly conductive anvil. Edward violently yanked his left arm backward, aggressively dragging the thick magnetic tethers still buried deep inside the royal predator's neck. The forceful, physical motion violently dragged Vargok up from the buckling, heavily irradiated floorboards. The massive alien beast swayed dangerously, heavily disoriented and severely weakened by the atmospheric assault, yet miraculously alive due entirely to the bleeding human actively shielding him. Edward stepped directly into the giant predator's personal space, entirely ignoring the razor-sharp serrated fangs hovering mere inches from his own unprotected throat. The human looked aggressively up into the glowing, multifaceted eyes of the towering extraterrestrial. When Edward spoke, his voice was not the polite, completely regulated tone of a low-ranking academy cadet. It was a terrifying, heavily distorted, subsonic rumble that carried the absolute, crushing weight of undeniable, apex authority. It was a primal, commanding frequency that aggressively bypassed higher cognitive thought and struck directly at the deepest, most foundational survival instincts heavily buried inside every predatory species in the known universe. Synchronize your current with me? Every single biological impulse violently screaming inside Vargok's heavily armored skull demanded immediate, unconditional submission. The towering beast did not hesitate, nor did he resist the violent command. The juvenile apex predator threw his massive, scaled head back and let out a deafening, thunderous roar that physically shook the floating shrapnel suspended in the air. Vargok forcefully ignited his own internal bioelectric generator, violently pushing his remaining natural energy outward, pushing directly against the overwhelming, chaotic antimatter radiation actively tearing through the human's glowing cybernetic grid. The physical connection between the two drastically different species violently resonated. It was an unprecedented, highly unstable fusion of raw, artificial human engineering and savage, natural extraterrestrial evolution. Vargok's highly specialized bioelectric frequency acted as a precise, biological focusing lens. It aggressively seized the chaotic, wildly vibrating subatomic storm raging inside Edward's artificial spinal nodes and forcefully synchronized the destructive waves into one singular, tightly compressed, hyper-focused electromagnetic pulse. The space directly between the bleeding human and the towering beast began to visibly warp and visually distort, aggressively creating a terrifying, blinding sphere of tightly contained, swirling purple lightning. Edward violently planted his heavy boots onto the violently vibrating deck, his artificial joints audibly screaming against the extreme physical stress. He heavily anchored his stance, twisting his muscular torso backward to physically gather momentum, treating the compressed sphere of apocalyptic energy exactly like a physical, heavy weapon. With a massive, primal shout that aggressively tore his own vocal cords, Edward aggressively hurled his entire body weight forward. He swung both of his heavily bleeding arms out in a devastating, synchronized strike, brutally directing the combined, synchronized fury of a human cybernetic overload and an alien apex bioelectric discharge squarely into the dead center of the titanium barricade. The resulting kinetic impact completely defied all known laws of Academy structural engineering. The highly directional, violently focused electromagnetic pulse struck the 1-meter-thick main doors with the unstoppable kinetic force of a collapsing asteroid. The terrifying, multi-dimensional pressure of the hybrid energy wave aggressively shattered the dense molecular bonds of the heavily reinforced alloy. A deafening, absolute, world-ending explosion violently ripped through the claustrophobic chamber. The sheer decibel level of the blast instantly shattered every single acoustic dampener in the entire academic sector. The invincible titanium wall simply could not withstand the terrifying, aggressive combination of completely reversed magnetic polarity and raw, compressed antimatter heat. The central locking mechanism, engineered to withstand the absolute vacuum of deep space and direct tactical bombardments, instantly flash melted. The heavy metal turned violently into blinding white-hot slag before explosively shattering outward into literally thousands of jagged, superheated, razor-sharp pieces. The heavy, reinforced doors violently blew completely off their heavy industrial hinges, aggressively tearing a massive, jagged, gaping hole directly into the side of the sealed lecture hall. The immediate, violent, atmospheric pressure equalization was instantaneous and aggressively chaotic. The heavy, toxic, chemically laden yellow fog that had been slowly suffocating the alien cadets was violently sucked out into the expansive, heavily ventilated main corridor. Simultaneously, a glorious, desperately needed tidal wave of crisp, freezing, highly oxygenated, heavily recycled Academy air aggressively crashed back into the devastated room. High above the sprawling, completely destroyed simulation room, the main Academy emergency network finally registered the catastrophic structural breach. A deafening, rhythmic array of high-frequency survival sirens began to wail aggressively across the entire quadrant, accompanied by flashing, brilliant blue emergency strobe lights. The violent, sudden rush of clean oxygen aggressively purged the localized neuroconflict stimulant completely from the atmosphere. All across the heavily damaged, scorch-marked floorboards, the massive, terrifying alien cadets who had been mere seconds away from total biological failure began to violently gasp, their massive chests heaving frantically as they pulled the life-giving air back into their burning lungs. Miraculously saved from absolute extinction by the exact species they had just relentlessly mocked. The deafening, rhythmic blare of the Academy-wide emergency sirens was rapidly accompanied by the heavy, synchronized thud of heavily armored boots. The elite internal security forces, flanked by a dozen high-ranking command officers from various planetary coalitions, aggressively breached the perimeter of the devastated academic sector. They arrived heavily armed, their tactical weapons drawn, and their thermal visors scanning the chaotic, superheated wreckage of the main corridor. High above the shattered titanium doors, safely tucked inside his heavily shielded observation bunker, Instructor Kalen watched the rapid response teams assemble. He meticulously adjusted his crystalline features, carefully wiping away his previous expression of malicious triumph. In its place, he expertly crafted a flawless mask of profound, bureaucratic devastation. He was absolutely prepared to deliver his carefully rehearsed narrative. He would recount, with highly calibrated artificial sorrow, how a tragic, entirely unpredictable containment failure in the secondary antimatter core had regrettably claimed the lives of his entire class. Most notably, the young royal heir, Vargok. It was the perfect political assassination, entirely disguised as an unfortunate act of cosmic probability. Kalen stepped confidently out of the pristine control room and glided gracefully down the elevated walkway toward the gathering officers, his hands raised in a gesture of peaceful surrender to the chaos. He abruptly froze, the faint, glowing inner light illuminating his translucent face violently flickered and dimmed. His sharply angled, crystalline eyes dilated to their absolute maximum capacity. From the dense, swirling vortex of black, heavily ionized smoke pouring out of the ruined lecture hall, a solitary silhouette slowly materialized. The heavy security forces immediately raised their particle rifles, shouting aggressive, overlapping commands for the figure to halt and identify itself. The figure completely ignored them, continuing its slow, methodical advance through the toxic haze. Edward Buchanan stepped directly into the harsh, flashing blue light of the emergency strobes. He did not look like a fragile academy cadet. He looked exactly like a mythical god of war who had just violently fought his way entirely through the burning gates of purgatory. The standard-issue synthetic uniform covering his upper body was completely gone, incinerated into a fine, dark ash that coated his heavily bruised skin. The highly advanced cybernetic lattice violently grafted to his spine was slowly cooling down, shifting from a blinding, aggressive white-hot glare to a deep, ominous, pulsing crimson. Because his core body temperature had been pushed so far beyond the absolute limits of organic survival, a thick, ghostly veil of white steam continuously evaporated directly off his bare shoulders and chest. He stood perfectly upright amidst the unimaginable destruction, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, completely unfazed by the dozens of lethal weapons currently aimed directly at his head. Then, the dense shadows immediately behind the human violently shifted. The security forces collectively gasped, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock rippling through the disciplined ranks. Several heavily armed veterans instinctively took a step backward. Emerging slowly from the billowing black smoke was Vargok, the towering, terrifying apex predator of the royal bloodline was heavily scarred, his normally shimmering obsidian scales visibly burned and cracked. However, he did not launch himself at the officers, nor did he attempt to flee. Instead, the giant beast moved into a low, fiercely protective posture, positioning his massive, heavily armored body tightly against Edward's right flank. Vargok deliberately lowered his massive head until his terrifying, serrated jaws were entirely level with the human's hip. A deep, bone-rattling growl continuously vibrated in the back of the predator's throat, actively warning every single heavily armed officer present that any aggressive move toward the bleeding human would be met with immediate, absolute, and overwhelming violence. It was a terrifying, unprecedented display. The proudest, most fiercely independent predatory species in the known galaxy had just offered its absolute, voluntary submission to a soft-skinned biped from Earth. Total panic forcefully seized Kalen's cold, silicon mind. The entire assassination protocol had failed catastrophically. If the royal heir survived to testify, Kalen's political faction would be completely and utterly annihilated, desperation aggressively overriding his logic. The instructor slowly slid his right hand behind his back. He frantically reached for the manual, physical fail-safe detonator heavily embedded into his wrist console, intending to instantly trigger the remaining antimatter reserves and violently silence the human and the beast forever. He inputted the heavily encrypted kill code and pressed the primary execution trigger. Absolutely nothing happened. Kalen frantically tapped the mechanical interface again. The holographic display on his forearm flickered weakly, spitting out a series of fragmented, corrupted error codes. The terrifying truth crashed down upon him. When Edward had violently channeled the synchronized electromagnetic pulse to destroy the blast doors, the human's highly advanced, heavily classified cybernetic system had piggybacked a highly aggressive, deeply hidden biological malware directly into the blast wave. The EMP had not just shattered the physical titanium. The invisible digital payload had completely infected the local network, instantly and aggressively stripping Kalen of all his administrative privileges and totally paralyzing his mechanical weaponry. Edward slowly turned his head, his cold, piercing eyes locking entirely onto the trembling instructor standing on the walkway. The human cadet did not rush. He walked forward with slow, terrifyingly deliberate steps, completely parting the sea of heavily armed, utterly bewildered security officers who instinctively moved out of his path. Vargok shadowed his every single step, a loyal, towering guardian forged in the fires of an artificial star. Edward stopped directly in front of the towering, crystalline alien. The sheer physical contrast was staggering, yet the human absolutely dominated the space. Slowly, Edward raised a heavily bruised, bleeding hand and lightly, almost gently, tapped his index finger directly against Kalen's transparent, rigid chest plate. When Edward spoke, his voice was not angry. It was terrifyingly quiet, carrying the absolute, freezing temperature of the deep void. "You thought you locked us in a room with death." Edward tilted his head slightly, a dark, terrifying shadow falling completely over his scarred face. "But you forgot something. Humanity survives because we know exactly how to swallow death." The absolute silence that followed in the corridor was heavier than the gravity of a black hole. High command officers swiftly moved in, violently grabbing the completely broken, wildly hallucinating instructor and dragging him roughly away toward the maximum security detention blocks. Edward turned away, casually continuing his slow, exhausting walk toward the medical wing. The giant, terrifying apex predator following obediently, step for step, directly in his shadow. Later that same solar cycle, the heavily encrypted, deeply classified incident report submitted directly to the Galactic Academy High Council was sealed tightly with a glaring, solid, red priority marker. The final, defining sentence of the document simply read, "Humanity has no sharp claws. Their weapon is the ability to make disaster bow its head." Thank you so very much for staying with us and listening to the conclusion of today's story. We would love to know exactly where you are tuning in from. So please take a moment to let us know your location in the comments below. If you found today's adventure thrilling and want to help our channel survive, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by utilizing the secure PayPal link provided directly in the video description or the pinned comment. Your highly generous contribution directly provides our dedicated staff with the essential salary they need to support their families, allowing us to continue creating and bringing you even more fantastic stories in the future. Thank you again, and we will see you in the next one.